What happens when the glittering image of royalty shatters, not into fragments of tragedy, but into revelations so vile that people wonder if the charm was ever real? When the carefully staged smiles, the uniforms, the medals, and the royal pomp are stripped away, what if what remains is not a dignified statesman, but a man racing through scandals like sins are his sport? That's not just a theory. It's the reality of Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. Born into palaces of gold, wrapped in layers of privilege, and adored as the Queen's favorite son, Andrew was never meant to taste consequence. For decades, he lived as though accountability was a concept for commoners, not for princes. And for a long time, the system agreed. His tantrums were excused, his arrogance overlooked, his recklessness covered by royal spin doctors. But every mask eventually slips, and when Andrew's did, it revealed a man who was less a victim of circumstance than a product of indulgence. By the time he reached 65, the world no longer saw him as the dashing bachelor prince or the decorated naval officer. Instead, they saw a disgraced man stripped of his titles, hiding from the public eye, and dragging the monarchy's credibility through the mud. This is not just the story of a prince who stumbled. It is the story of a man who believed he could speed-run his way through life's gravest misdeeds: cheating, arrogance, exploitation, fraud, even ties to the darkest scandals of our time, without ever facing the music. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Andrew's fall was not sudden. It was decades in the making. His scandals weren't shocking twists. They were the inevitable outcomes of a character molded in entitlement and polished in impunity. The same boy who mocked guards and swung sticks at horses grew into the man who humiliated staff and threw tantrums over teddy bears. The young prince who learned that his position protected him from consequences became the middle-aged duke who believed his wealth and status could shield him from global outrage. Prince Andrew's journey is not just a cautionary tale about privilege gone unchecked. It is a mirror, reflecting the monarchy's greatest flaw, and it forces us to ask, what happens when the institution meant to symbolize honor becomes the shield for dishonor itself? In the present day, Prince Andrew is no longer remembered as a man of service, charm, or promise. His name has become shorthand for scandal, disgrace, and humiliation. Once, newspapers praised him as the dashing young bachelor prince, a naval officer with courage and charisma who might modernize the monarchy's image. Now, when his name surfaces in conversation, it is followed not by admiration but by ridicule. Andrew is the embodiment of what happens when privilege without restraint collides with the unflinching eye of public opinion. At 65, he is a man stripped of everything that once defined him. Gone are the royal duties that once gave him purpose. Gone are the military honors he wore with pride. Gone even is the respect of the nation that once cheered for him as a Falklands hero. Instead, he is a sidelined figure, forbidden from public duties, banished from official royal appearances, and even humiliated in ceremonial traditions. While his siblings wear uniforms decorated with honors, Andrew must appear in plain suits, stripped of symbols he once believed inseparable from his identity. The contrast between his then and his now is staggering. In the 1980s, Andrew was the prince the press adored. His service in the Falklands War gave him an aura of bravery, and photographs of him in uniform adorned front pages. Women admired him, tabloids dubbed him a heartthrob, and even his romances became the stuff of gossip columns. At a time when his brother Charles was viewed as stiff and awkward, Andrew seemed the carefree, modern alternative, a breath of fresh air within the monarchy. But beneath that surface, insiders already saw cracks. Staff described him as entitled and arrogant, a man who barked orders without thought for those beneath him. His arrogance was excused as youthful immaturity, his tantrums hidden from the press. The public only saw the prince who smiled for cameras, not the one who screamed at servants behind palace walls. Now, the illusions are gone. The man who once basked in adoration has become a pariah. His disastrous 2019 BBC Newsnight interview accelerated his downfall beyond repair. When confronted about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein, Andrew offered bizarre defenses that only deepened suspicion. He claimed he could not sweat, that he was at a Pizza Express in Woking on a night he was accused of misconduct, and that his friendship with a convicted sex offender had been a mistake. What was meant to be a redemption moment became one of the most infamous interviews in royal history. A televised train wreck that sealed his fate. Today, Andrew is not the monarch's soldier or the Queen's favorite son. He is the black sheep of the House of Windsor, a symbol of entitlement, recklessness, and shame. The distance between who he was supposed to be and who he became is not just wide, it is unbridgeable. Prince Andrew's downfall might appear sudden to outsiders, but those who looked closely at his childhood saw the warning signs from the very beginning. Unlike his elder brother Charles, who carried the weight of the crown as heir, Andrew was the spare, important enough to be adored and indulged, but never burdened with the same level of duty or discipline. This position gave him freedom, but it also planted the seeds of arrogance and recklessness that would define his life. Born in 1960 at Buckingham Palace, Andrew was the first child of a reigning monarch to be born in more than a century. His arrival was celebrated, his childhood cushioned in palaces, and his every need anticipated before he had to ask. But instead of teaching him humility or gratitude, his environment reinforced the idea that he was untouchable. Unlike Charles, who often found himself scrutinized and criticized, Andrew quickly became known as the Queen's favorite. That favoritism shaped him in ways no one would correct. Biographers and palace staff often point to early stories that reveal the kind of boy Andrew was and the kind of man he would become. At around 5 years old, Andrew wandered into the Windsor Castle stables, where guards and grooms were working. Instead of watching quietly, he mocked the guards, teased their dogs, and even swung sticks at the horses' legs. When the servants asked him to stop, he ignored them, enjoying the chaos he caused. Eventually, 2 frustrated grooms had enough. They picked him up and threw him into a pile of manure, even shoveling dung over him. Most children would have been horrified and humbled by such a moment. But Andrew was different. The humiliation didn't leave a lasting mark because no one followed through. No one insisted he learn respect. The incident became a funny story, not a turning point. Another early memory paints a similar picture. Andrew reportedly taunted a palace footman so cruelly that the man, breaking every rule of protocol, struck the young prince in the face. Andrew ended up with a black eye, sprawled on the floor in shock. The footman, expecting dismissal, offered to resign. But in a surprising twist, the Queen refused to accept it. She told those around her that Andrew had earned the strike. The footman stayed, and Andrew learned a new lesson. Even if someone retaliated, his title meant survival. He could provoke, insult, and dominate, and still remain shielded. To outsiders, these stories might sound like harmless mischief or the exaggerated tales of palace life. But to those inside, they read like prophecy. The boy who mocked guards would become the man who mocked staff. The child who raged over being struck would grow into the adult who raged at servants over curtains and teddy bears. He didn't just test boundaries, he learned that boundaries didn't apply to him. As he grew older, the same traits deepened. Staff whispered that Andrew was spoiled, demanding and dismissive of anyone he considered beneath him. He relished his status as the Queen's favorite and wielded it as a shield. Where Charles felt the pressure of expectation, Andrew basked in indulgence. The message was clear. He was special, he was untouchable, and he never had to change. By the time Andrew reached adolescence, his reputation within palace walls was sealed. He was arrogant, entitled, and alarmingly immature. To the outside world, he was still the smiling young prince. But to those closest to him, the future was already visible. His early years weren't just childhood, they were the blueprint for the scandals to come. By the time Prince Andrew stepped into adulthood, the seeds of arrogance and entitlement planted in childhood had already begun to bloom. To the public, however, he was still carefully marketed as a charming royal bachelor. The palace presented him as the adventurous, handsome son who would balance Charles's stiffness with charisma. But behind the cameras, Andrew was cementing a reputation that would haunt him for decades. Spoiled, reckless, and dangerously immature. In the early 1980s, Andrew briefly captured the nation's admiration during the Falklands War. Serving as a Royal Navy helicopter pilot, he flew missions under genuine risk. Newspapers celebrated him as a war hero, and photographs of him in uniform boosted his popularity. For a short time, the soldier prince image worked. He was brave, handsome, and apparently committed to service. Yet even in the military, whispers about his arrogance circulated. Fellow servicemen quietly noted that he carried himself not as one of them, but as someone always aware of his royal blood. The war polished his public image, but it did little to change his behavior. Back in palace life, his staff knew a different Andrew. The Andrew who demanded perfection in the smallest of details and lashed out when things didn't meet his impossible standards. Former maid Charlotte Briggs recalled how Andrew once screamed at her for leaving a tiny gap in his curtains. Humiliation over something no one else would notice was routine. Worse, Andrew's obsession with control extended to his private collection of stuffed animals. Yes, stuffed animals. Despite being a grown man in his 30s, Andrew required his servants to arrange his teddy bears in exact order, following a detailed map. Any mistake triggered explosive tantrums. To outsiders, these stories later sounded eccentric. To the staff, they were daily reminders that they served a man who never grew up. His parents only reinforced the problem. The Queen often excused his behavior, brushing off staff complaints with indulgence. Prince Philip, more blunt, dismissed him as the spare, a son destined to live in Charles's shadow, but free from the crown's crushing expectations. That freedom, instead of giving Andrew space to grow responsibly, fueled his arrogance. Without the burden of being heir, he could indulge every whim, and indulge he did. By the mid-1980s, Andrew's public image had already begun to slip. The press nicknamed him Randy Andy for his endless string of girlfriends, ranging from actresses to models. Unlike his brothers, who were more cautious, Andrew flaunted his playboy lifestyle. He enjoyed the attention, carrying himself as if the rules of discretion and decorum did not apply to him. His marriage to Sarah Ferguson in 1986 looked like a fairy tale, but quickly unraveled. Scandals plagued their union, and while Ferguson's escapades grabbed headlines, Andrew's own recklessness contributed to the collapse. Their divorce left him free again, but not respectable. Inside palace walls, staff continued to complain of his immaturity and cruelty. To them, he was not a royal leader but a man-child, lashing out when things didn't go his way, obsessed with symbols of power but incapable of the responsibility that came with them. To the monarchy, Andrew was no longer a dependable representative of the crown. He was a liability, unpredictable and increasingly embarrassing. The image of the charming young prince had begun to crack. The world saw a bachelor playboy, but insiders already knew the truth. Andrew wasn't just immature. He was dangerous to the dignity of the monarchy itself. If Andrew's childhood foreshadowed arrogance and his adulthood reputation revealed immaturity, his scandals exposed the full scope of his recklessness. Unlike his siblings, who navigated public life with at least some caution, Andrew seemed determined to treat his royal position as a ticket to indulgence. Each decade brought a new layer of controversy, building a reputation that transformed him from a national embarrassment into a global disgrace. By the late 1980s, his playboy persona was already the stuff of tabloids. The press called him Randy Andy, and he seemed to relish the nickname. He was seen with actresses, models, and socialites, parading his wealth and status in public. Where discretion could have saved him, he chose spectacle. Instead of guarding the dignity of the monarchy, Andrew flaunted his excesses, convinced his royal blood insulated him from criticism. When he married Sarah Ferguson in 1986, there was hope that he might settle down. The wedding was broadcast to millions, a fairy tale moment that seemed to soften his image. But the fairy tale collapsed quickly. Their marriage was riddled with problems, and both partners became tabloid fodder. Ferguson was photographed in compromising situations, but Andrew's own reckless behavior fueled gossip as well. Their eventual divorce did little to distance him from scandal. Instead, their continued closeness, odd, almost suspicious to outsiders, only deepened rumors about his private life. The 1990s cemented Andrew's reputation as a liability. While ordinary British families struggled through economic recession and austerity measures, Andrew was living in excess. His love of luxury travel earned him the mocking nickname Air Miles Andy. He used helicopters for short trips, flew on private jets at the taxpayer's expense, and indulged in lavish holidays. Each trip cost the public millions. Newspapers documented his spending habits with outrage, questioning why a prince who performed so few meaningful duties was draining the nation's coffers. But Andrew dismissed the criticism. In his mind, he was above scrutiny. Behind the palace walls, staff continued to see the same patterns of arrogance. He demanded absolute perfection, berating employees over the smallest mistakes. His obsession with status symbols grew. He was meticulous about how many medals he wore, desperate to look decorated and admired, even when his service record did not warrant the display. His friends and acquaintances noticed his desperation to be flattered. Those close to him began calling him gullible, easily manipulated by anyone who fed his ego. Instead of surrounding himself with respectable allies, he gravitated toward people who offered him the illusion of importance. This flaw would later drag him into the darkest scandal of his life. By the late 1990s, Andrew's naval career had ended, leaving him adrift. He was appointed as a special trade envoy, supposedly to promote British business abroad. But instead of boosting the UK's image, Andrew embarrassed it. Reports emerged of his ties to dictators, shady businessmen, and controversial regimes. Leaked U.S. diplomatic cables described him as arrogant, rude, and dismissive, so unprofessional that he mortified the British officials working alongside him. Rather than strengthening trade relations, he turned the role into a personal networking platform, trading on his royal title for influence and favors. Meanwhile, his personal behavior grew more careless. He was photographed partying, associating with questionable figures, and living as though scandal was an acceptable companion. By the 2000s, his recklessness was no longer just embarrassing, it was dangerous. The monarchy relied on public trust, but Andrew seemed determined to test it at every turn. The scandals didn't just tarnish Andrew's image, they eroded the monarchy's credibility. At a time when the royal family was working to modernize, his antics dragged them backward. To the public, Andrew wasn't simply immature, he was corrupt. To the palace, he wasn't just difficult, he was toxic. What no one fully realized then was how far Andrew's arrogance would eventually pull him into the mud. His hunger for status and admiration left him open to the influence of people far darker than playboys and dictators. And when Ghislaine Maxwell introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein, the final chapter of his disgrace began to write itself. Prince Andrew's scandals and missteps were never random. They were the product of a personality carefully shaped by decades of privilege, indulgence, and unchecked entitlement. From childhood, he learned that rules applied to others, not to him. The boy who mocked guards, swung sticks at horses, and lashed out at palace staff was also learning a lesson in survival. That power shields you from consequences, and privilege makes the world bend to your whims. This mentality hardened over the years. Andrew became obsessed with admiration and status, craving validation from anyone who would flatter him. Inside palace walls, he surrounded himself with sycophants and enablers, people who amplified his sense of importance rather than challenge his flaws. He sought respect, yet was incapable of earning it. Medals on his uniform, the arrangement of his stuffed animals, and the theatrics of his public appearances were all attempts to assert control, command attention, and manufacture prestige. Andrew's arrogance was matched by his immaturity. Even as an adult, he threw tantrums over minor errors by staff, demonstrating the same inability to tolerate imperfection that had marked his childhood. Curtains not aligned to his specifications, small mistakes in personal service, or even minor disruptions in his carefully curated social image triggered explosive reactions. To outsiders, these might seem eccentric. To those living under him, they were abuse. Gullibility was another defining trait. Andrew was easily swayed by flattery, willing to associate with people who bolstered his ego without regard for morality or consequence. This need for admiration blinded him to danger and ethical boundaries, ultimately exposing him to individuals like Jeffrey Epstein. It wasn't simply poor judgment, it was a structural flaw in his character, reinforced over decades of entitlement. Privileged and unaccountable, Andrew never learned restraint. He grew up shielded, and in adulthood that shield turned toxic. It enabled him to flaunt rules, ignore criticism, and treat people as disposable. The combination of immaturity, arrogance, and gullibility created a man who seemed invincible, but whose vulnerabilities would later ensure his downfall. In essence, Prince Andrew's personality was a mirror of the system that produced him. The monarchy nurtured a boy who never had to learn accountability, and that same boy grew into a man who weaponized privilege, exploited others, and ultimately became a public scandal. His flaws were not anomalies. They were inevitable outcomes of a life built on entitlement, indulgence, and unchecked power. Prince Andrew's downfall was not sudden. It was the inevitable result of decades of recklessness, entitlement, and poor judgment. By the early 2000s, he had already accumulated a reputation for arrogance, immaturity, and scandalous behavior. But it was his association with Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein that transformed a personal liability into a global disgrace. The introduction came at a time when Andrew's career as a royal, envoy, and military officer had already stalled. He was seeking relevance, yet his judgment was clouded by his need for flattery and admiration. Maxwell, a socialite with a mysterious and controversial network, became his gateway to Epstein, a financier whose crimes would later rock the world. Andrew, accustomed to privilege shielding him from consequences, engaged in a friendship that would irreparably damage his reputation. Accusations of sexual misconduct surfaced, and Andrew's responses compounded the problem. His 2019 BBC Newsnight interview was meant to clear his name, but instead became a global spectacle of denial and arrogance. In it, he attempted to explain away his ties to Epstein, claimed he could not sweat, and insisted he could not have been present where accusers claimed he was. The result was catastrophic. Instead of earning sympathy, he appeared dismissive, evasive, and detached from reality. Public opinion turned sharply against him, and even his status as a senior royal could not shield him from scrutiny. Legal battles followed. Andrew faced lawsuits in the United States from accusers alleging sexual abuse. Settlements and ongoing media coverage ensured that his scandals remained in public consciousness, further eroding any remnants of his once dashing reputation. Every headline reinforced the narrative. The prince had not only failed morally, but had dragged the monarchy into ignominy. The palace, long protective of Andrew, could no longer maintain the illusion. Queen Elizabeth's previous shielding, covering debts, smoothing scandals, preserving appearances, proved insufficient. Andrew was forced to step back from public duties permanently. Military affiliations were stripped, royal engagements canceled, and public appearances curtailed. Where once he had been a symbol of royal privilege, he had become a cautionary tale. The factors that led to his downfall were rooted in both character and environment. Andrew's childhood taught him that rules applied only to others. His adulthood reinforced that indulgence could shield him from consequences. His personality, a combination of arrogance, gullibility, and a desperate need for admiration, made him susceptible to influence from dangerous individuals. By the time the Epstein scandal erupted, he had become both a predator and prey, a man wielding privilege recklessly and a man ensnared by poor judgment. Ultimately, Andrew's downfall was complete when public opinion, legal pressure, and media scrutiny converged. No longer the charming soldier, no longer the Queen's favored son, he became a symbol of what happens when entitlement, recklessness, and protection from consequences collide. His life, once cushioned in gold and indulgence, now stands as a cautionary tale of public humiliation, legal jeopardy, and moral collapse. Prince Andrew's story culminates in a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked privilege and the corrosive power of entitlement. What began as a boy shielded from consequences became a man whose misdeeds were amplified by the very system that had enabled him. The connections he formed, the reckless behavior he indulged, and the arrogance he wielded ultimately ensured that his life would no longer be celebrated, but condemned. The most damning chapter of his life began with Ghislaine Maxwell's introduction to Jeffrey Epstein. Andrew, already desperate for status, admiration, and social validation, found himself drawn into a world of moral compromise and criminal activity. Epstein's network, underpinned by manipulation and exploitation, preyed on Andrew's flaws, his gullibility, his arrogance, and his belief that his royal status made him untouchable. What the palace had failed to teach him in childhood, responsibility, empathy, accountability, would now be exacted by the world. Public revelations about his ties to Epstein ignited global outrage. Allegations of sexual misconduct, coupled with decades of reckless behavior, painted a portrait of a man utterly disconnected from reality and morality. The 2019 BBC interview intended to defend him instead became a defining moment of disgrace. Every word, every excuse, every gesture reinforced the perception of a man who believed his title was armor against consequence. Legal battles followed, exposing Andrew to accountability he had never faced before. Lawsuits in the United States brought him under scrutiny not just as a royal, but as a human being answerable for his actions. Settlements, media coverage, and court documents ensured that his transgressions remained a matter of public record, leaving no room for redemption. No amount of palace spin could repair the damage. Inside Buckingham Palace, the staff and the monarchy recognized the gravity of the situation. Andrew was no longer the charming spare. He was a liability whose actions threatened the crown's credibility. Long before the public fully realized the extent of his failings, palace insiders had concluded that his behavior, selfish, reckless, and morally compromised, was dangerous. His privilege had shielded him for decades, but it could not protect him forever. Andrew's downfall is a reflection not only of his personal flaws, but also of the system that raised him. A boy given everything and accountable to no one became a man whose recklessness, entitlement, and poor judgment left him isolated and reviled. His life is now defined not by medals, uniforms, or royal connections, but by scandal, public humiliation, and moral failure. Ultimately, Prince Andrew's story is a cautionary tale about the consequences of privilege without responsibility. It demonstrates how a life insulated from consequences, nurtured in indulgence, and reinforced by power can evolve into disaster. The golden walls of Buckingham Palace that once shielded him could not stop the world from seeing the truth. A man groomed to be admired became a man despised, not just for his actions, but for everything he represented. The monarchy may endure, but Andrew's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that entitlement, arrogance, and impunity are far more destructive than any palace scandal could ever contain.